Yep, I'm here.
Awesome.
I'll be there in 1 second. All right. Hey. So I want to start because I'm.
Wait.
Yeah.
Let me do my introduction.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No worries. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Free Your Mind with Dr. Sheena Mason. Today, I am here with my good friend and geneticist, Tade Souaiaia. Pretty sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. He is not a stranger to my channel. I'll link the previous conversations that I've had with him here for your review and viewing pleasure. Today we're here to talk about a very specific topic, which is primarily sports and this thing called race. And so I'm looking forward to being the student today because this topic I know virtually nothing about except what I've seen Tade kind of educating people on in the Twitterverse. Tade, welcome back to the channel. I'm happy to pass the mic to you. What were you going to say?
Yeah, before we got started with the sports thing, I want to ask you one question. So a criticism of your work has been that it's neoliberal colorblindness. So I think the neoliberal, I mean, that doesn't make any sense because like Margaret Thatcher is not known for her like colorblindness, but I just want to hear sort of why isn't it that, but also what's wrong with that? Why? And I've sort of done like a little informal survey. I've been asking people, at work, are they colorblind? And like most people are like, yeah. And then a few people are like really like reeled back. We're like, oh, no way. It's really bad to be colorblind. But then I asked them, they couldn't really tell me why. And so I'm trying to figure out like, why is this a criticism? If it is a criticism, why isn't it true, or is it true? And then what's wrong with being like a colorblind person? Why is that not a good goal?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, this is a sort of persistent behind the scenes conversation that you and I have, because you tend to be pretty dumbfounded as to how people would interpret it that way. But then also I think there is a question of if it was colorblindness, or if it were promoting colorblindness, why would that be a bad thing? So I think of colorblindness as operating within racialist ideology, meaning I see something about you that I interpret as race, or about myself that I interpret as race, and then I'm just one of those morally righteous people who doesn't want to treat you differently based on what I perceive to be your race, or what you assert is your race. Now, for me, how that's distinctly and profoundly different from the theory of racelessness and what I help people grapple with and understand is the interpretation of phenotype or ancestry or anything, a person's racialization into race is a place where I'm intervening, right? Because as a racial skeptic, I contend that race doesn't actually exist. So there's nothing to ignore. There's nothing to ignore in terms of skin color, which is obviously a biological fact. There's nothing to ignore about a person's DNA or ancestry, also biological facts. We can see or we can know any of that information about a person, and we can honor whatever that means to a person without pretending that those things are race or are evidence of race. And when I say race, I'm really talking about an American conception of race, like Black and white, Asian, etc. So to me, the theory of racelessness helps people explore racial skepticism as in the non-existence of race, to dismantle and undo the negative effects of racism and stop racist ideas from continuously getting passed on to future generations. Colorblindness does not do that. At least to my knowledge, that's not how colorblindness works, because the entire premise of colorblindness is that race exists, color is a proxy for race, and I can overlook that or ignore that and keep it moving. That's not how race ideology works. And also, what is wrong with colorblindness? Well, besides the fact that as a racial skeptic, I contend with the idea that race exists. So for me, colorblindness falls short because it's still operating within the racialist framework. There's also a tendency of people who profess to be colorblind or who aspire to colorblindness and ignoring the problem of racism. And when people say that as a sort of criticism of the theory of racelessness, more often than not, without knowing anything about the theory of racelessness, of course, what they're criticizing is this is just a way for people to not acknowledge the problem or existence of racism. And the theory of racelessness, the entire premise is that it helps people stop racism in its tracks and free themselves from the negative effects of racism. So for it to be colorblindness in that regard, I would have to actually be teaching people that, number one, racism doesn't exist, never has, never will, right? Or it existed once upon a time, but never anymore. I'd have to be doing something like that, which I'm not doing. That's the entire premise of the theory. Racelessness, as I think of it, is racismlessness, but people misunderstand because that's what people can do. And so in all of those ways, and probably even more than what I've said, it's vastly different from colorblindness. I should also add that colorblindness in and of itself is not a theory. It's not a framework. If you're in academia, especially if you're in, the humanities, you will, or the sciences, talking to a scientist, you will know what a theory is as it pertains to your respective fields. I think the average person who's not average, meaning people outside of academia, which is going to sound worse than I intended it to. A lot of people who aren't in academia hear the word theory and they translate that into it's an idea, right? It's just people have an idea about racelessness. But the theory of racelessness is an entire framework, right? It gives people a toolkit. It has rules that are unique to my conception of racelessness and my identification of racelessness. And that toolkit is something that other people can learn and apply to their own professions or places of interest or relationships, etc., or individual work too. Colorblindness doesn't give that to people. And I have yet to come across a framework of colorblindness, a theory of colorblindness that does any of that.
So that's fair. So what you're making is a skeptic's perspective on why racelessness is not colorblindness. But the people leveling the criticism are not skeptics. They are racialists. So what I'm trying to figure out is what is their racialist conception? Like they identify as like racialist non-colorblind.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to figure out what's the utility there to say like, no, I see race, it's real, and I don't ignore it.
Yeah, because
seems like it seems like if you're gonna be a racialist, please be colorblind. And just seeing like the stories I just see, like just the anecdotes, like, if you get on an airplane and you are like, you look at a little bit lost and can't find your seat, and the flight attendant assumes that you're sitting in coach because you're a Black woman and because of systemic racism, they see that and make an inference about what type of ticket that you can afford. Most people will be a little bit offended by that. Right. And it's because you're not the flight attendant is supposed to be colorblind. Right. We're not supposed to assume that people can't afford something, or we're not supposed to assume, that people have some deficiency due to racism. So it seems like we expect people to be colorblind if you're going to be a racialist. Don't we then want you to treat us as if you are colorblind? Isn't that a good interpersonal heuristic to be colorblind?
So one thing about how you just articulated that made me sit up straighter in my seat. You spoke about the flight attendant example, and you spoke about how you said something to the effect of most people aren't going to presume a deficiency in the flight attendant's way of seeing because of racism, but which is correct. The emphasis being on your use of the word racism. But where people go wrong is they would articulate it in the language of race. So they would say that most people would not presume some sort of deficiency in the flight attendants thinking because of race. And that's why they emphasize the perceived existence and importance of race, because they're really trying to emphasize the existence of racism. And it is that sort of misdirection that gets people in trouble as it pertains to colorblindness and criticisms of colorblindness, because yeah, I think aspirationally, one would think that colorblindness would be the goal if we're going to say that race exists, which you obviously know I contend. One would think that would be the goal, but where colorblindness has gone terribly wrong is that people have used a sort of colorblind way of seeing themselves and other people to dismiss the problem of racism to begin with. And so for the racialist person who is insisting on the importance of significance and existence of race in a way, in an effort to reject and stop racism in its tracks, ostensibly, that requires an acknowledgement of racism in the first place, which for too many people, colorblindness prevents. And that's one place where my theory is also more effective, because some people might reject or refuse to acknowledge the problem of racism, both historical and contemporary, in part because of how they are racialized. Their racialization might cause them to feel the need to be, feel defensive or shameful or guilty or whatever, as it pertains to how they see themselves in a race. And in that way, they can even subconsciously reject the problem or their complicity in racism and in the system of racism, as a lot of racialists will say. The theory of racelessness has been seen as a reprieve for people who would like to see themselves as colorblind, because it doesn't give them an out, as some people might say, but it does give them a framework that doesn't paint them into corners as being forever the racist, for example. You're not seen as white in the space in the theory of racelessness, because everyone is raceless. That's one of the rules. And if everyone is raceless, then that means that I am not part of the same machinery of racism, technically speaking, that I'm trying to analyze and make more visible. And so from a place of racelessness where I'm not emphasizing your so-called whiteness or your so-called blackness or anything pertaining to race ideology, now we can start to turn a more critical lens and critical view toward the history of racism and a more astute eye toward what racism is today and the differences. And so, yeah, the criticism that I see from that and that I hear from some people, fortunately a very small minority of people, who try to immediately just conflate my work with colorblindness, it's because their conception of racelessness is a faulty conception of racelessness. But their conception doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from the history of race ideology. It comes from the fact that the absence of racelessness, has been conflated with the idea of whiteness, right? It comes from the fact that studies have shown that people who are racialized as white often view themselves and see themselves as raceless, meaning they don't see race as important to who they are and how they are. And that the difference between a person racialized as white and one racialized as black, and the weight that they put on the category of race, often comes down to a person's experience of racism. And so long as we continue to package whiteness and misperceive racelessness with whiteness, which also gets packaged and conflated with freedom and liberation from racism, then we will continue to elude freedom from racism, and we will continue to unintentionally uphold it. And those are also reasons why colorblindness falls short. And if we want to view colorblindness as some sort of a framework, it woefully falls short because it encourages too many people to racialize themselves still, and in that racialization to lock up racelessness and freedom from racism in with one race, right? The so-called white race, which is hugely problematic. And people would do well to recognize the differences. But Tade, the people that you're speaking about, particularly on Twitter, and Ogie, who's in the audience, will know this too. It is my assessment that those same people are not engaging with my work in good faith. They don't want to understand.
I'm trying to figure out the best steelman argument I can give to them for how they don't practice at least interpersonal colorblindness. Like, I think most of the examples of non-colorblindness where you racialize something, or you racialize someone and then presume something about them, would be perceived as being somewhat racist. Like the best argument I've heard, and I've asked a bunch of people, and most of them say, "Oh, I'm not colorblind." And it's okay. Well, then how do you treat people differently based on their race? And oh, well, I don't. Well, then, I mean, interpersonally, at least, you are colorblind, right? And the one argument I heard was in 2020, when George Floyd was killed, I wrote an email. I told my Black students that if they didn't want to show up for class that week, they didn't have to. So I wasn't being colorblind because I recognized that they might be extra sad. And I guess that might be somewhat socially acceptable, right? But so that's the only socially acceptable. I mean, I don't agree with it, but I think that's not going to get you fired by doing that. And I think that's maybe the only socially acceptable sort of invocation of non-colorblindness. Most of them, like most examples of someone not behaving interpersonally colorblind to somebody, aren't well tolerated, right? Like, I think most people don't want that. I mean, I wouldn't want to be told I can take time off because of the race of someone who died. But I mean, maybe I'll admit that that might be socially somewhat acceptable, at least today. Right. And that's like the only example, which is sort of an edge case because it's kind of sneaky, right? Because I wrote my class and I said, like, the Black students, or I don't know if they use Black or people of color, right? They can take time off, because they didn't say it about any single, like, one student, right? Because they're saying, out of a class of 50 with 10 Black students, I'm telling, like, all of them that if they want to take time off this week, they can. But at the same time, I think this professor, and that's who, I'm not going to say their name, but I don't think they would go up to a single Black student and say, George Floyd died. I bet you're sad. You don't have to show up for class this week, because that could be perceived as really offensive, right? So, like, even when they're claiming an example of non-colorblindness, it's an example where, like, they're like washing out their offensiveness by spreading it over 10 people or like 20 people and hoping it'll land on sort of one of them, right? Like, nobody's, but like in an interpersonal relationship, not people who believe in race and like racial types, to not be colorblind is either offensive or just silly, right? I mean, it could be a silly stereotype. You're assuming somebody can dance, or you're assuming somebody likes a certain like color of shoe, but I don't think that's what they're like really talking about. I don't think they're saying I'm not colorblind because I make jokes about race. Like, I don't think that's the point. But I think the only like sort of acceptable ways to not be colorblind are that weird George Floyd example, which is new, and then people make jokes, which I don't think, like, not everyone is so bothered by that. But beyond that, I just think it's interesting because I don't like the people who are most critical of racistness and are most critical of colorblindness. They only seem to practice color, so I don't see them actually invoking color when it comes to so-called oppressed people. I see them only invoking for themselves. I do see them they'll say, like, well, I don't really have an opinion on that as a white man. They'll say something like this. So, like, their colorblindness is their lack of colorblindness really mostly references themselves, right? They think that race matters for them, and they're not afraid to like tell you why, but they don't actually make too many presumptions. And I think they're aware of the fact that, you know, presuming something based on someone's race is not a great thing to do, you know, if you want to have friends, right? Like it just doesn't work too well. So that's why it just seems like a hollow, it's a strange, strange thing to be so quickly against, when as a heuristic, it's probably what most people like practice to some extent, would you say?
Um, no, I wouldn't. I wouldn't. Because here's the problem, right? Probably a lot of problems, but you know how I'm always talking about how people conflate race with culture and ethnicity and class?
Yeah.
Well, part of the sort of knee-jerk reactions against colorblindness too, if you're talking to a particular person who's against or anti-colorblindness, part of what they hear when they hear colorblindness is a blindness to difference, period. Like a blindness to difference in terms of the fact that people look differently, a blindness to the fact that people have different ancestors, a blindness to the fact that people have different cultures and ethnicities by extension. And I think that part of the resistance that you're describing is rooted in the fact that people hear color blindness and automatically presume that you or some person, you know, espousing something that they perceive to be color blindness as a sort of washing over of all of these other meaningful differences among human beings. And the idea that, so I hear that too. I hear that, I hear that in a lot of spaces, and also as a professor of undergraduates, I've had students tell me, you know, sort of preface before they say something like, I'm a white person, so, you know, what I think really doesn't matter nearly as much as you guys over there, like the so-called students of color. And it's like that type of a person, God knows I hate typing people, but that type of a person,
but that's the type of person
that you're talking about. It is that type of person I found to be resistant, at least initially, to the theory of racelessness and definitely to colorblindness, in large part because they've been really taught to see race in that way, to see race as including and necessitating and dictating a person's culture and so on and so forth. So I'm less highlight. It's like the paradox of I'm highlighting my whiteness in this instance because I'm going to speak on the so-called Black experience, which I can't have any knowledge of because I'm not Black. And I want to honor Black people and the ancestors and the struggle and slavery and Jim Crow and all, like every racist thing, bad thing that has happened to so-called Black people. And I'm going to do that by, you know, saying out loud and believing, right, that my opinion doesn't matter because I'm not a so-called Black person. But then, of course, that type of thinking, and they think it's logic, but it's not logical to a large extent. That type of thinking falls apart because then as soon as you have, and this is timely, a Clarence Thomas coming into the mix, and this is a Black man by that same person's way of seeing the world, right, and seeing human beings. This is a Black man, but because their politics aren't what a Black person is supposed to have, and because they think in a way that so-called Black people aren't supposed to think, now then the race card, as we might call it cheekily, falls apart because it's not that Black experience that I'm concerned about, because it doesn't fit my often racist, limited, essentialized version of what it is to be Black. And so it really only works to maintain racism. And by that I mean the cloudiness that raceless ideology causes for all of us in terms of what is and what isn't racism, and then the negative effects of what race and racism are, and then the detrimental effects of what it is to see people as outsiders or to see oneself as an outsider. That type of language and thinking maintains and upholds the whole thing. But that type of person is, I think, sincerely convinced that they're right, that they are right when they look at Dr. Mason and think that, she's got it wrong. She's one of those Black people, right? Because they're all looking at me like I'm Black.
That's wild.
Like, she wants to be white because she's in denial of her Blackness and her Black heritage, and she's ashamed of her Black culture. That's what people are. That type of person is capable of hearing when I'm talking, which is like super ironic to me, but that's part of racism. That's part of what racialist ideology does. It convinces us that there are right and wrong ways to think about particular races. And I think the problem that the most left-leaning people are falling into right now is that pitfall, is that trap of, I'm on the right side of racism, but they have arguably racist ideas about people, about human beings, because of the racialization.
Why can't they just hate Clarence Thomas? Why do you think that is?
Why can't they just hate him?
Yeah, because
they do hate him.
No, but they have to point out his race in their hating of him.
Oh,
is it because if they just said they hate him, then they'd be saying, I hate a Black person? They don't want to do that. So they want to make everyone know that, like, I hate him and he's a terrible Black person. He's the wrong kind of Black. Like, it's almost like they're afraid to just hate him, right? To just straight up hate him, right? And not mention his race, because then someone might say, why do you hate him, right? It's like they're getting ahead of that question, right? By pointing out that, no, he's like the absolute worst type of Black person. That's why I hate him, because he's a bad Black person, instead of I just hate him. Right, because I see a lot of the hate. I don't see that many criticisms where they just hate him. Almost every criticism, they invoke his race.
Oh, every time. I've been seeing people call him the N-word, and pat themselves on the back for their anti-racism. Like, I think so there are a lot of reasons that inspire people to think in these ways. But when I talk about racism hiding its face as race, I'm talking about that kind of thinking, right? That kind of, you have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to tell yourself that you're right about that, and even if you take a lesser extreme example than Clarence Thomas, who arguably there are plenty of reasons to dislike his ideas, right? Or to dislike him. Even if you take lesser extreme examples, the fact that so-called Black people have never fit in the box that racism created for them to fit into is part of the racism that I'm saying persists through racialist ideology, and everyone participates in it. It doesn't matter if you lean left or if you lean right, you're participating in upholding it, because you have these corrupted views of what it is to be a racialized Black person or a racialized white person that seem innocuous. I saw some, I forget the actor's name. I feel like he was in Everybody Knows. That's the jingle, not the Cheers. I feel like he was in Cheers. So he goes way back. I don't think he's been in too many current things, but he was like he did a video rant against Clarence Thomas and was really going hard. He was like, you despicable spit bucket. I don't even know where he got insults from. If he did a Google search, like, what are some insults that I can use in this video? But he like slung everything. He's like, you creep, you woman violating, like SOB. It was like everything under the sun. Probably wanted to say the N-word, but was wise enough not to go there. But it was like that kind of venom, right? That kind of, the idea that to be a racialized Black person, you have to think in this one way, while simultaneously saying there's not one way to be Black, right? But actions speak louder than words. So as soon as you don't subscribe to whatever accepted narrative of what it is to be so-called Black, then all of a sudden you're trying to be white. You're uppity, you're a coon, you're an Uncle Tom, right? You hate Black people. But then on both sides, people will be fast to call out the discrepancies, and yet infrequently do people have any semblance of an idea of like, how do we get out of that quagmire? Colorblindness, I will concede, is not it, because it's still operating within the fiction of race ideology. So it still affects people's psyches and affects the ways that people teach and pass on traumas to like actual human beings who don't deserve to inherit particular types of traumas, if we're being honest. So colorblindness falls short from liberation. And race ideology, for all of the reasons I'm saying, I view as being this, it's just a different side of the same coin of colorblindness, because, you know, those vehement anti-racists are still speaking out against racism, but then practicing racism by believing and agreeing that there's one way to think or be Black, or one way to think or be white. And you know, newsflash is like, you can have some people fit completely neatly into the stereotype. You can have some people who will fit into a caricature of what it is to be racialized in those ways to American imaginations. But 9 times out of 10, that's just not true. So why are we all pretending like it is, and pretending like it's helpful in any regard, when it's really just a tool to keep us divided and in conflict? And then you and I are kind of on the fringes, or perceived to be on the fringes of racial thinking, because we, you know, in many regards we are, because too many people have bought into the whole thing, you know. And if it helps, and maybe it doesn't, but if it helps, I will say the type of person that we were talking about pretty extensively, that same type of person that we just sort of like psychoanalyzed, they often do come along for the journey of the theory of racelessness, but I will say that they do come along just at a slower speed, because they have a healthy and understandable amount of skepticism as it pertains to what is being communicated here. And those who have been willing to engage meaningfully, like read any of my stuff or have a conversation with me or listen to my 5,000 podcasts or whatever, more often than not, they end up, even if they don't agree with the methods, they end up understanding and seeing the difference between, you know, what they thought it was versus what it actually is. And I think more often enough, they do feel persuaded. It's just a matter of time and patience. And you can appreciate, you are skeptical about a lot of things because you think for yourself. So you have a healthy amount of skepticism about a lot of things. And you strike me as a type of person who's not going to be like 100% like, oh yeah, that completely makes sense to me. I agree. Especially if it were challenging your entire worldview. I don't think you would be quick to jump on the wagon. You know, I'm challenging people's entire worldviews.
Well, I think for me, my entire worldview, there were cracks in it. Like as soon as I, you know, like to whatever extent I believed in race when I was like younger, I was already noticing inconsistencies, right? And that's the thing. Like when you believe something that's false, like so hopefully like you're challenging a worldview that for a lot of us, and yeah, I think it does depend on how you are like racialized, how you're brought up, like, but for a lot of us already seems false or seems a little bit broken, right? So I mean, I guess you're right. You can maybe appeal to other people, but it's going to be harder. But for a lot of us, it's like we already knew that something was wrong with this, right? This already wasn't making sense, but it was what it is, right? There's these different races, and that's how it works, and fine. But this doesn't really make sense to me. So then when you hear about something like this. It's like, oh God, okay, yeah, So yeah, I guess I stay skeptical, but it makes a lot more sense, right? Because you're challenging, hopefully, a view that people have at least questioned a little bit, ideally, right? So I mean, because I think it's really hard to. I mean, I remember one of the very first times I was like, something's wrong, because like in 2008, and that's the last time I really voted for a president, actually. So 2008, Obama wins, and I'm in California at the time, and I don't know if you remember this, but there was a proposition that passed. It was Proposition 8, and it banned gay marriage in California. And I was like, oh, interesting, because like the polls were saying it wasn't going to pass, and it was going to pass, and then I saw one story that said that Proposition 8 passed because we had massive Black voter turnout for Obama. And I was like, that doesn't fit the narrative, right? Because like the narrative has like the Democrats who support the Black people and the gay people. But in reality, it looks like from the exit polls, right, that when the Black people come out to vote, they vote against gay marriage, at least in 2008, more than they vote for it, at least relative to the white voters or Hispanic voters. I'm not sure, but point is, like, you already notice that there's these cracks in like this story of like intersectionality and all these groups that are all friends, and then there's a bad side and then there's a good side, and then I guess that's a narrative where it's a statistical argument, and I guess Clarence Thomas is like the human incarnation of that, where he just blows up your brain, right? Like he believes everything wrong, right? He's not supposed to believe any of these things, and he believes all of them. He doesn't miss one, right? So it's just like, I was noticing it more statistically that like these stories don't all make sense, right? These stories about Trump the racist and this and that, and like that's why Trump lost because Black people didn't vote for him. Well, we know that's not true, right? Between 2016 and 2020, he picked up the Black vote, and in fact, it was like white older people that didn't vote for him in 2020, right? So like you see all these stories that statistically, like the whole political narrative of race is completely broken. And what we're going to talk about, the narrative of race in sports doesn't make a lot of sense. The narrative so I mean, it's now become a political tool, right? And I think that's really unfortunate to people that to people who can think critically about politics and about statistics. That's obviously false, right? And so I think even if without the science, genetics, and any of that, like race has already been completely hijacked. Like even if it was a meaningful biological distinction, it's already been completely hijacked, right? So now it's a political tool built on top of a broken biological system, right? So it's done anyway. But yeah, so for sports, do we have any
great segue.
Yeah, I know, I'm not good at those. Yeah, do you have any particular questions, or should we just get started?
I'm confident that the questions I have are going to be answered based on the pictures that you have here.
Okay.
I will say, just to give folks a little bit of background, oftentimes in the Twitterverse, people will ask questions about, or it's not even about they don't ask questions, they just assert the realness of race in biology or in nature. And they'll use examples such as sickle cell disease, which I talked extensively recently about on Critical African Thinkers channel recently, and also sports. And this idea that so-called Black people dominate sports and are biologically superior in the ways of athletics. So I told Tade, I need you to explain this to me because I would see his responses, but truth be told, hadn't taken enough time to like work through his responses to see what his reasoning is in response to those kinds of examples that people give on Twitter. So I invited him to come talk with us today and give us a lesson on race and sports. So I have here some of the different images and videos that you sent, Tade, and we can start wherever.
And so first, let's talk about, I guess, let's try to give the best case for why people think that. And let's even say like where it's true, right? So let's be totally honest. Like the average height in Peru and Ecuador, I think a man is like 5'8" or something like this. It's small. But I think it's like 5'6". And the average height in the US is like 3 to 4 inches taller. Right? The average height in Northern Europe is like 5 inches taller. All right. So you're gonna imagine that like there are different, and I guess these don't qualify as races, but there are different population groups that are different height. Like that's not really a controversial thing to say. And when you think about sports like the NBA, you're gonna imagine that you would see less of the short people, of the groups where people are on average shorter, they're gonna be in the NBA less. That's true, right? And height is a somewhat complex trait. And in genetics, when there's a complex trait, like that's like, what does that mean, right? So I brought up sickle cell. So sickle cell is not a complex trait, right? It's a really simple trait. It's a single allele, which means it's one mutation. So it's a really strange trait to racialize, because if you look at like the mean blood viscosity, right? It's some measure of vascular health or like hematological health in blood. And, sickle cell is not that high in the US, but, imagine it was. Imagine that, 20% of Black Americans had sickle cell. Well, that would mean that like the mean hematological health of Black Americans is less than white Americans, even if you kept everything the same, right? Because the bottom 20% would be a lot lower, this is a segue, but like, ironically, that's sort of how we get the wealth gap, is this bottom 20%, even if the rest is not that different, we can sort of we can appropriate the rest of the distribution with the bottom 20%. So we can do the same thing for sickle cell. The bottom 20% had this blood disease that was extremely rare among white Americans. We say, well, look, on average, Black people's blood health is worse. It's true, right? On average, it's worse. The mean would be lower. But we can instead say, like, if you have sickle cell, it's worse. And if you're Black and you don't have sickle cell, it's not. Right? So it doesn't make sense to look at the average blood health among a group of people when you know what the cause is, right? It's a nonsensical idea. And you see that when all these like analyses of class, where they have a Black middle class and a white middle class. When they say the Black middle class doesn't have as much money as the white middle class, well, it's because they start at the bottom. Right, but it doesn't make any sense to like racialize class, because stuff costs the same whether you're white or Black for the most part, like in this country, right? So it's sort of, if you use mean blood health as a metric and talked about the means, it would be sort of nonsensical, because this is not a complex trait. This is a trait that you have or you don't have, right? And so if you don't have it, then your race doesn't matter, right? So if you do have it, then also your race doesn't matter. Right. So height is something sort of in between that. So height is complex, but not extremely complex, where there's probably more than one way to be tall. There's more than one genetic background, right? So there's more than one genetic way to arrive at being tall, but there's not a ton of different ways to do it, right? And then you can think of something that's, probably a more complex trait, something like IQ, where we don't really know what's going on. And in fact, the trait itself is sort of hard to define, right? And so sports is kind of like that. Whereas most sports, like, yes, something like height, that would be a complex but simpler trait. But something like sprinting ability, there's this myth that sprinting ability is a non-complex trait. So on one side, which is the ridiculous side, which I think is sort of unfair to characterize people, but there are fools. There's people that think that there's like a gene myostatin 2, and they think that this gene, this mutation, this gene means you have more fast twitch like muscle fibers. And so there's a guy actually who wrote a paper. He went to Jamaica and he sequenced Jamaican athletes, and he was hoping that they would have more, and they didn't. They had far less, right? So he thought it was a single gene. So he thought that, being fast in the sprint is like having sickle cell. So like that's going to explain the difference. And so that's clearly not true, right? But I would go farther. I'd say it's actually like sprinting, like to run fast is far more complex than height. To run fast requires certain combinations of abilities, and there's different combinations. So, and I guess we can pull up some of the pictures I sent. So one thing that we talked about before the live stream started, I guess this is complex, and let's be careful here. one thing that we talked about before, let's get to the other picture. The one with Usain Bolt. Yeah, so a fact is that in the US, especially, if you look at Black Americans and white Americans per height, the Black Americans will have slightly longer legs. And in sprinting, that gives you an advantage. It also gives you a small disadvantage in swimming. But of course, there's massive overlap. So if that was all, and then you'd expect Black Americans to have a small advantage in sprinting, because the short-legged Black people would be slow, the short-legged white people would be a little bit slower on average, we think, and there'd be a higher rate of the longer-legged Black people than the rate of the longer-legged white people. But that's not the only way to run fast. So if you pull up the next picture.
Is it the one that I had up first?
Yeah.
Here, I think I can do my side.
So anybody that knows sprinting, when they see these two guys run, this is Maurice Green. He's a former world record holder, ran 9.8 all the time from like the late 90s. And this is Su Bingting, who this last year became the fastest person ever in the first 60 meters of the 100 meters. They're both short. They're both shorter than 5'10". They both have like really powerful quads. They run really similar. Maurice Green was a former world record holder in the indoor 60-yard dash. For Su, he doesn't run indoors, but if he wanted to take it, he probably could. They don't finish quite as well. I'd say Green actually finishes probably slightly better. Su Bingting has improved a lot. He used to be just a guy that would be way ahead of like everybody in the first half of the race, and then everyone would like pass him. Now he stays ahead of people for like 65, 70 meters, and the fastest guys in the race will still pass him. He's still not, the top guy in like the 100. His times are pretty on par with Green. Green's times, which were the best in the world, maybe like 2 decades ago. So they run the same way, and they have similar morphology. And so the thing is, what makes a great sprinter? There's multiple body types. So I'm just showing two, and anyone that knows running knows that you can look at a sprinter and you can see, oh, this guy runs in this fashion, right? Like this guy has incredible stride frequency. That's these two guys, like incredible power. They run super pitch forward, right? Their top speed's not super elite. They probably aren't great at the 200 as well as the 100. It's true. Like neither one of them was great at the 200. These type of runners almost never run the 400. And it's a certain body type. And it's a body type that might be less prevalent in one race and more prevalent in a different one. There's enough diversity in humans that it exists in all races, right? So again, it's kind of silly to say this, but yes, like across Chinese people, obviously like the tallest guy in the NBA, I think for a long time is Yao Ming, who's from China, extremely like long legs, but on average, like Chinese people are shorter on average. But so to achieve something in sprinting, there's like 7 ways to do it. I'm just going to show 2 here. And so if you go back to the last photo, so this is Usain Bolt, and he's the greatest of all time, right? Everyone knows that. And to his right is Christophe Lemaitre. He is, I think, still the European record holder, although he may have just lost it in the 100. And I think he attracted a lot of attention because he was the first white man to run below 10 seconds. Interestingly enough, he did not like the attention. And what's interesting about him and Bolt is like they're both obviously tall. They both have incredible top end speed, right? They both will, even if they're behind, they'll catch up to people. They both have like the way that they strike the ground is like really similar. They both actually have spent a little bit more time on the ground than the other guys, but they make more power. So they go a little bit farther per stride. And they have somewhat similar personalities. Like Christophe, if you if you know people in track, he's sort of known for, he trains, he runs, and he goes back to like where he lives in sort of like rural France and drinks wine and like eats cheese and doesn't really talk to the media and like just wants to kind of do his thing and then run. And Bolt's like really famous for that, right? That he didn't want to like live in the US. He lives in like Jamaica. He like stays there, he parties, he has a lot of fun, and he doesn't care, right? Yeah, he trains hard, of course, because they all train hard, but he has a reputation for not sort of devoting his entire life to it, to also like, enjoying his life and going and having fun and dancing. And Lemette sort of the same way. So when Lemette would be like asked about race, he'd just get super angry, right? But what's interesting is anyone who knows track will tell you that these two guys have way more in common than the other two guys who also have way more in common. So the point I'm trying to make here is that if sprinting was like a black trait, then Bolt and Green would be somewhere, would run the same way. Green is the guy in the other photo. And Lemette and the other guy's from China, so maybe there'd be like a Chinese way, a European way, and a black way. The black way would be superior, right? If that was the case, that would make sense, right? Then it would seem like a racialized trait. But you don't see that, right? I mean, all these guys are all outliers, but what you see is they all have sort of a different way of accessing speed, and there's a ton of diversity in how you can do that. And you can't necessarily give Bolt the start of Sue or give Green the top end speed of the next. It would change how he runs, right? It's just like a car. You can't you can swap in an engine on a car and it won't necessarily make that car faster because the weight of the car is different or something. And even in sprinting, the stereotypes that we've been through over and over, like before Bolt, like when I was running, and so I kind of stopped running for the first time as Bolt kind of came to prominence, which for a lot of us, like a lot of athletes like that were not that great. So guys like me, Bolt sort of like rewrote like everything, right? Like the year I remember 2003, the guy who won the world championship ran a 10-1. So there were guys that could sort of see themselves doing that one day. It sort of seemed within reach, and then Bolt came and ran like 9.7 and then 9.6 and then like 9.5, and it just kind of changed everything, right? So before Bolt though, the guys that were like really good, like Trenton Holiday was in college at the same time as me. He's like 5'4". There was this idea, and Green was sort of the top guy. There was this idea that to run the 100 meters fast, you need to be short. You need to be short and powerful. That was the claim. So we thought, what's interesting is the stereotypes, even if within the track world, they might not be about race, we still sort of make these same mistakes. We think that's how you run fast. Then Bolt came along and it was like, oh, no, actually, you need to be tall. I don't think anyone really knows. Maybe one is optimal. I mean, right now I lean towards being tall because that's what Bolt is, right? So, I mean, but I think it's just that it's hard to know if there's really one way, but clearly you can achieve world-class status. You can run in the Olympics multiple ways. There might be a best way, but it has not come out yet. And sure, yeah, if there was a singular way and that way involved some morphology that was more present in one race than another, then you might be able to claim it's a racialized trait. So that's why I think it's important to, so I know a lot about, the short sprints because those were my events. I do admit to people that I don't know about all track and field. So the longer races, maybe those are not as complex. Now I realize that that's my bias, right? Of course, I think what I do is complex because I know a lot about it. And I see some other trait like swimming. Well, that's just how like buoyant you are, right? It's like, I assume that that's a single trait. And so that's really simple. So whichever group has the highest rate of some simple function will have an advantage. Now I do, again, speaking as a non-expert in long distance running, I think there's a little truth to this, that I think that in the marathon and then the longer races, there might be a huge advantage involved with sort of your ability to live on less like oxygen. So people that live, I mean, we do know for sure that people who train at altitude have an advantage. And it might be that people that live at altitude, who and also have, genetically to some extent adapted to live at altitude. So there's a certain valley in Kenya where, we think there's a lot of like ancestry that comes from sort of a high altitude lifestyle. We see the same thing in Nepal. Now there aren't a bunch of like Nepalese runners, but we see the same thing in, sorry, can you hold on for 1 second? Be right back. All right, back. Let's see. Oh, can you start my video?
I think you had to. I can ask you to start it.
Oh, okay. There, I'm back. Okay, so yeah. So where was I? Yeah. So there's not a lot of like Nepalese runners, but there is data that there's people from the Andes, people from parts of Kenya, people from Nepal that might be better when it comes to low oxygen. That might make an advantage in long distance running. So again, not really a race because it's, there is environmental adaptation, but it could be that, I don't know long distance running enough to tell you that there's only that there aren't multiple ways to do it, but it could be that no matter what style you use, there's this overwhelming need to have good VO2 max basically to breathe well. And it could be that certain groups have evolved to live at high altitude and therefore have a big advantage in those sports. Now I don't know if that's true, but I think when it comes to racing sports, to be as honest as possible, it's like, yeah, while I reject this idea for the short sprints that there's one way to do it because I know a lot about it, it's more reasonable to make the argument that for long sprints, for the long distance runs, that you have this need. Although I think that the last thing I'll point out about sprinting, I guess I'll ask you this, is where do you think the sprinting, or not just the sprinting, but the running world records lie?
Like what country or region?
Yeah, yep.
Man, I know I've seen you talk about this on Twitter, and I wish I had paid more attention to that that tweet.
Do you know the East-West stereotype?
As in East and West Africa?
Yeah. East-West Africa stereotype.
People tend to think that West Africa takes the cake.
No, not quite.
Is that the stereotype?
People
No, it's the other way
seem to
around.
think that the West Africans can sprint.
And the East Africans do distance. Far. Okay. Yeah. But the reality, yeah, you're gonna have to tell me. I could guess. Okay, so, my mind is like telling me Greece, but that's terrible.
Let's see if you can guess this. So of the world records in male running events, so that's from 100 meters up to the marathon, there's only one person who owns any of those who's not from Africa. Wow. Can you guess who he is?
No.
We just talked about it.
Oh, is it it starts with an L? No, is it Sue?
No, it's Bolt.
Oh, both of them. Okay.
No. It's Bolt.
Oh.
Usain Bolt. He's from Jamaica. Yeah. No, but
see what you did there. You tricked me.
Every other record is held by somebody from Africa, born in Africa, competing for Africa. Not even competing for a different country, right? Like who competes for a country in Africa. So Bolt is the only exception. Wow. So Bolt owns the record in the 100 meters and the 200 meters. But except for Bolt, the African record is the world record for every other event. Right. So Bolt is sort of this guy who's, very incredible, but besides Bolt, the African record is the record across every running event. So that makes people think, well, okay, this must be racial, right? How is it that Africa is so good at running? But they also have this idea that there's this East and West thing. So what I'm going to try to do is sort of say, okay, well, let's go to the shortest record, which is not a world record because Bolt owns that one. So the shortest sprint is 100 meters. Where in Africa do you think that comes from?
I'm gonna guess this wrong. I'm sure.
That's
fine. Man, when I think of running, I think Kenya all day.
Oh wow! So you're actually right. Most people wouldn't guess that. So the 100-meter record, which most people would think would come from West Africa, actually comes from East Africa. There's a Kenyan guy who owns the 100-meter record. The 200-meter record comes from Namibia, which people will call West Africa, but if you know the continent of Africa, Namibia is not West Africa. It's closer to South Africa. The 400-meter world record comes from South Africa. And I mean, and you know, that's and then the 800-meter record comes from Kenya again. So we have 100, 800. The 1500 record comes from Morocco. The 5K record comes from, I could get this right. It's either, I think it's Daniel Coleman. So I think or else it's Chapter guy. So it's either, I think it's Uganda. And then I think the 10K is also either Uganda or Ethiopia. And then the marathon, I'm sure, is in Kenya. So you can see how like these records bounce around the continent. So what's interesting is this does uphold this idea that, okay, the Africans are superior at running, but it doesn't uphold this idea that West African genetics make you sprint fast, East African genetics make you run long. So that's what I think is really interesting about this, because if you know sports at all, you look at someone who can run long, and there's actually sort of a discontinuity. People who can run really far usually can't run as fast. So that I was sort of breaking down the body types that make you fast in the 100 meter, and there's a disparity in types, right? So like the people that have this type don't have this type, and you don't want sort of a mixed type, right? Like you want to be tall and lean, or you want to have like a ton of power, right? But there's even bigger difference between the physiology it takes to run a marathon and the physiology it takes to run a 100 meter. But the fact is, the marathon world record and the 100-meter world record, they come from the same country. So that suggests that this idea that there's this genetic race that makes people run fast doesn't make sense. Now, albeit I'll admit that all the records are in Africa. But what does that tell you? To me, that just tells you that African people are superior because they contain all the diversity in the world. Right, that like everybody came from Africa, so like everyone outside of Africa, they have some new genetics, but it's mostly drift. So yeah, so I mean, you can say, this isn't PC, but I have a friend who always says that, like, if you're gonna think of who are the smartest people in the world, he says they're probably in Africa. And it's like, who are the dumbest people in the world? Also probably in Africa, right? And it's this idea that you're gonna get. You have more, if you pick 100,000 people in Africa, you are going to get more physiological diversity than if you pick 100,000 people outside of Africa. That's true. So, but again, I still think the main fact is there's places in Africa, like in Kenya, where they have a massive running tradition. Morocco also has the Atlas Mountains, so they have a massive running tradition there. And the Brits, and what's interesting is this stat that every record is held by a man from Africa. This is new. The Brits used to hold a ton of records, and then as they lost them, they kind of stopped trying, like as hard, right? And there's a good chance that some of them are going to get taken. So we don't count it as a sprint event, but the 400-meter hurdles world record, which was just set by a Norwegian, and the 1500 record, there's a Norwegian kid who's coming up who might take down a few of like those records. So these are transient. This fact of all the records being in Africa is commonly used as a claim that shows that there's a racial component to running. But then when you look at where they are in Africa, in my opinion, it sort of destroys the idea that there's a genetic regional component to running. So we can pull up the last figure.
Is it the black and white one?
Yeah. That's just a picture, but there's a figure. There's like a bunch of like numbers.
Oh, yeah. Okay, Let me find that one. I thought you meant figure as in person.
That's just a table.
Here you go.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a little blurry. This is a picture of my computer, but a lot of times people will say things like, so before Christophe Lemaitre ran sub 10 in the 100, a lot of people used to love to say, there's never been a white man to run under 10 seconds, and that's no longer true. But this is what they have now, right? So now you can say, okay, well, there's a big enrichment in black people to run fast. So this is just, again, the 100 meter. And at the very top of the figure, what you're seeing is sort of the enrichment in 100 meters under 10. So you can see that, like, if you look up, well, these are all tiny countries, right? So St. Kitts and St. Kitts and Nevis is so small that they only have one guy to do it, but their total per 10 million is way higher. And you can see Jamaica is actually in 5th place by this metric, but it's also because, like, these are tiny little islands that have only one person. So, okay, so you can see that, like, there, if you look at the top 10, you can see that the US is not on it, and that Namibia is on it, but I don't think any other countries in Africa are on it. It's all the Caribbean. So the Caribbean is actually dominant in running, not Africa, as far as 100 meters, not Africa, and not the US, which has the most money for training and has a large African-American population. You can see that there's still domination by the Caribbean. So then you say, okay, well, that's not fair because all these little countries only have one person. Let's take them out, right? So then you go down to the next thing, and now you're seeing that you have Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad, and Tobago. Your top 3 countries are still all countries in the Caribbean.
But you know what people would say, though, right?
What's that?
That still proves the existence of race because, those countries are still
70. Jamaica has 70 athletes per 10 million to run under 10. The United States only has 1.8. So Jamaica has 50 times as many. And yes, Jamaica doesn't have as many white people, but the US is still more than like 10% Black. So that means that Jamaica, so if we do the math on that, if they have 50 times as many, and the US is only 10% Black, then you can divide that by 10, but they still have 5 times enrichment in 100-meter athletes. And so if you look at this, and if you look at the countries in Africa, you can say, okay, the African countries don't count. They don't have as much money. They can't invest in sprinting. But the US has more money than anywhere in the Caribbean. Anywhere in the world, really. So what's the excuse? Why aren't the African Americans running as fast as the Caribbeans?
You're saying that if it, okay, I just want to
my point is
try
that
to articulate
if you're going to point to the data and say there's no way that there can be such a disparity in Black sprinting versus white sprinting without genetics being the primary cause, then you should also look at the data and you can say there's no way the disparity can be so big in American sprinting versus Caribbean sprinting unless Caribbean genetics is the cause. Some special Caribbean genes that they have. Because the disparity is just as great.
So let me say this back to you, Tade, so I can make sure that I'm following you, and perhaps this will be beneficial to any of the people listening too. So in very basic terms, if it were racial by the sort of American conception of race, Black, white, etc., then you're saying that across the board, where there are a substantial amount of racialized Black people, and never mind the fact if those people are also in relatively high numbers in countries that have the sort of means and access to better training facilities and all that other stuff, that the numbers should be somewhat equal across those spaces. But because that's not the case, that's evidence in your mind against this sort of reductive. It's a racial.
I'm more saying be consistent, right? So what someone who's a racialist will say is they'll say if there's they'll say, okay, I'll accept culture as an argument, or I'll accept something besides genetics, but then they say, but not with this disparity. It's just too big. There's just too many fast Black runners in the Olympics. When I watch it, there's not enough whites. It can't be that big of a difference unless genetics is the primary cause. And like I said, it's not that genetics can be no cause, because I've already conceded that that why aren't there enough runners from Peru? Well, again, they don't run, but they are a lot shorter, right? And again, there's going to be more than one way to run. So it could be that, some countries have genetics where they have a higher rate of a certain way of running. That's also totally possible. But what they'll say is there's no way that the numbers can be so disparate unless there's a distinct genetic difference between group A and group B, because I see too many of group A. So, if I saw twice as much, fine, culture, luck, randomness, whoever, but I see 10 times as many. And you just can't have a disparity that big unless it's genetic, and I see what they're saying. I agree that there are disparities that big. Like I would say the disparity between male and female times is so big that it's hard to conceive of the idea that that the reason men run faster than women is a cultural encouragement of men or something like this. That may happen and that may contribute for sure. But I think that the primary difference between men and women, I think it's fair to assume there's a biological advantage in sprinting that men have, right? Because I see that like all the world record times of the women are, are like a second different in the 100. It's 2 seconds in the 200. It's 4 seconds in the 400, right? So you see that there's big gaps in performance, and so it's like sure, but of course, the male times across races are separated by, tenths of a second. They're tiny, tiny amounts that they are separated. So we don't have that. But there comes, okay, yeah, it's true that like the percent differences are very small between the races. But the enrichment at the top, I can't imagine that unless there's a racial advantage. It's like, okay, fine. Your rule is when you see 5 times more, whatever, some cutoff, that you imagine that can't be true unless there's a racial difference or, a group difference. In this case, they're looking at race. So there has to be a racial difference because their groups are the races. So then I say, okay, fine. But then you have to also believe that there's a huge advantage in Caribbean genetics, that has to also be primarily a biological difference because that difference is just as big. And in fact, these numbers that you're seeing in the second table, like you see Canada pop in with 5. I mean, in those 5 people, I know 3 of them off the top of my head, right? So, Don Bailey, Ben Johnson, right? They are Jamaicans who moved to Canada. So they're not even really Black Canadians, they're Jamaican Canadians, right? So in the US, many of what we call US runners have Caribbean parents, Jamaican parents. So this is sort of an unfair number to give the US 62. You should scale it down to how many were American born and had sort of 2 parents born in the US. Many of them didn't. Many of them had parents born in the Caribbean. And so there's this Caribbean dominance in sprinting, but nobody some people do. Some people attribute it to like a diet full of yams. Some people do attribute it to some, biological factor, but I don't think it's taken nearly as seriously. But the disparity is just as big. And these are islands. If we know anything about genetics, islands are where you have, drift and you have, small groups of people that have similar genes. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to say that there's a genetic difference that is behind the Black-white disparity, but there's not a genetic difference. And no one really takes serious the idea that there's a genetic difference behind Caribbean versus, and really it's mostly Jamaican, but, Caribbean, well, Trinidad is up there too, to be fair, but Trinidadian, Jamaican genetics versus US genetics. That also doesn't make a ton of sense because they're different islands and they're somewhat separated. So they'd have different genetics, each one of them, but that's not really taken seriously, right? And if we scroll down more, what you'll see, scroll down a little bit more, you'll see that before Bolt's record, the numbers looked a little bit different. So before Bolt came along, Jamaica didn't have, they have a 67 per 10 million. Before Bolt ran, Jamaica had a 23 per 10 million. That to me is just the proof of the cultural impact of someone like Bolt had. This year, I hope that we're all going to watch it in 2 weeks. We have the World Championships of Track and Field coming up. I'm calling an American sweep in the 200. I think we're probably going to see it. In 2012, we had a Jamaican sweep, right? We had Bolt first, we had Blake second, and we are third, which is incredible that an island of 2 million people gets first, second, and third, and you're only allowed to enter 3 people. So for the Jamaicans to sweep is incredible, but Bolt had this massive effect on people, which I don't think is a genetic effect, it's a cultural effect. So he massively changed things. So you can see here you have the US before Bolt not having nearly as many people. You have India had 33, still, I mean, number one overall. And you can see Nigeria's on the list, Ghana's on the list. And you can see why before Bolt, a lot of this race, like realist stuff, if you read it, a lot of it was sort of pre-Bolt, where they liked these numbers, right? So if you look at this table, you say, okay, Trinidad, Jamaica, and you see US, and you see Canada, which is really just Jamaica again. But then you see Ghana and UK, which is just Jamaica again, because Olympic Christie's Jamaican. I think all three of the UK runners are Jamaican. Nigeria. So then they're saying, oh, look, it's West Africa. C, because it's the countries from West Africa, and it's the countries that have the West Africans in them. C, they're all West African. And there's no European countries on the list. And so now go down to our last table. I'll move this. And we see Jamaica, number one. Not surprising, like I said, Bolt sort of changed everything. So the amount of new athletes that Bolt sort of added to that list since the last 5 years since he sort of left, there's still a massive effect from Bolt. But then you see, okay, South Africa, and South Africa is not necessarily, I mean, it's not West Africa. And in fact, the top guy from South Africa, Wade Van Niekerk, he's racialized as colored, which means his like ancestry is like European, possibly some indigenous to South Africa, and also from the Indian subcontinent. So he's South Asian, European, and African. And then you see the third rank is Japan. The second rank is Italy. Now I'll caveat that because someone pointed this out to me that one of those Italian, now that number for Italy I think should be 3, but it's 2. But one of them is a guy who was born in America to an African American father, Italian mom. But the other 2 are Italian stock. And then you see U.S. and then Turkey is also fake because that's actually none of them are Turkish. One got some, I think, Azerbaijan or Armenian, but it's still like near Turkey. And the other guy is unsurprisingly a Jamaican. But you can see that like you lose this West African component here, right? Now you have South Africa, Asia, and Europe popping back up. So you can see that like a lot of this is sort of lore. It's sort of what was. And I look at this as sort of a positive thing. Like the emergence of Japan in sprinting is, I think, a positive thing. And if you know anything about the sprinting culture in Asia, I've been to Japan, but I've ran with more people from China. But there's a Chinese like a belief that they can't run fast, and sort of like almost a shame about it. And I think they've really gotten over that. So I think that they've actually sort of escaped their race. And I think race is this sort of, you can see in sprinting that it's going to hold countries back that believe in it. And you can see that most of these US times are not white Americans. They're all Black Americans. But you can see that Italians and people from, Armenia and people from Japan, they're running fast. But I think that the white Americans are going to be held back by this idea that they can't run fast. And I've seen this over and over again, that when you train people, when you train, when you train American white people in sprinting, they just believe that they can't do it. And that's just devastating. And so the last point, I think this is a good segue. I don't have the picture of him, but I think it's also important to talk about how people who do believe that track is sort of a singular ability, they like to use muscle fiber type. They'll say things like, well, it's just all the same thing. You run fast, jump high, it's all the same. And so what's interesting is that there's only been 2 guys to jump more than 27 feet and run under 10 seconds in 100, under 20 seconds in 200. One is Carl Lewis. The other is this kid in college, this white American kid who just did it. And if this was just sort of one ability, this would be much easier, right? The people who jumped far would also run fast. And you see that that's actually a lot harder than you think. And like to run fast, obviously, like there's a link. You're not going to be incredibly slow if you can jump far, but it's not like the association isn't nearly as strong as people think. And the last person to bring up, which I think sort of ties this whole thing together, is I don't have a picture of him, but you can Google him, is the world record holder in the triple jump. Sort of the bounciest event you can be. I mean, if you want to think about like a animalistic, something that should be associated with a race, is almost like you have to behave like a kangaroo. You basically jump as far as you can in 3 jumps. And the GOAT, the greatest of all time, is this very sort of slim British guy. He's very British, very, very white. And he's like untouchable. Yeah, this guy. But what's interesting is if you meet the guy, if you like talk to him, and he's a pretty kind of different type of guy, because he was famous because when he was young in the Olympics, he would like race, or not race, but compete in like different contests. He refused to compete on Sunday. And what it was is he was so devoutly religious. He like really believed that like God wanted him to jump, and he set all these records. And he retired. He was on a Christian show for a while as a presenter, and then one day he abruptly like retired from that, and he gave up his religion. He's no longer religious. And in interviews, he's super candid about how the fact that he lost his faith. He no longer believes in God, but he also believes there's absolutely no way he would have jumped this far without believing in God. And I think that's something that's really underrated. In like, yeah, I think racialization is bad for like all of us. And it's bad if you think that like, oh, I'm Black, so I'm not gonna be as good at math as the Chinese person, but I'm still gonna be okay at math. Fine. But if you want to be the greatest triple jumper of all time, first of all, it's probably not going to be you, no matter what your race is. It's only going to be one person, right? It's almost an irrational belief to even hold that you can do it, right? Like it's to actually believe that like you can be that is very difficult. And what you see is this big enrichment in like religiosity, right, among a lot of like top athletes, and it's because like how are you going to hold on to this idea that I'm going to jump farther than anyone in the world's ever jumped without some like extremely deep faith? And so you see that a lot. And it's interesting to be able to talk to somebody like him to hear what he has to say, because he's very candid about his faith because he lost his faith, right? And so I think that like the idea that the impact that race will have on you, it's sort of the same thing, only instead of perhaps being a positive influence like a religious belief can be, racial identity can be paralyzing, right? So you can see that yes, sports do, I think the biggest, yes, like I said, there's differences in height in people, so I don't want to pretend that like all groups would all be the same, even if, I mean, obviously there's going to be cultural differences, but of course, like there are different groups that are going to have different average height and like different abilities. But what I think the sports disparity shows us is just how harmful race is for people. Like once you racialize a trait, you make it almost impossible to achieve for different people. And I mean, you can make it, and so I do think that the disparity is really striking. I just don't think it's showing what they think it shows.
Thank you so much, Tade, for explaining that. Yeah, it definitely helped crystallize in my mind because, I was taking pretty diligent notes throughout. And the thing that I kept writing down was the sort of steel manning that you were doing for people who would contend that this particular thing is evidence of race. I kept writing down that it's still not racial, right? Even the misconception or the sort of myth that comes behind West Africans being able to being the best sprinters, it still struck me that that's still not racial, because if you're racializing everyone who comes from the continent of Africa within a certain time period, since all of humanity came from Africa, but within more recent centuries, if you racialize the people who come from Africa as Black, for something to be racial, it would strike me that it shouldn't be, we shouldn't be able to pinpoint it to a particular place, right?
True.
Like that to me
is a lot of the new races are now willing to cut Africa in half, which I don't think is a I mean, yeah, I agree that alone should get you to abandon race the way that we do it. but some of them like weirdly like, okay, I'm still going to racialize people. I'm still going to call people black and white, but actually there's two blacks. There's East Africa, there's West Africa. Those are now two races, black A, black B, right? And they're pretty comfortable in doing that. And so I like to make the point that no, that doesn't make any sense either, because the top 100-meter runner in Africa is from Kenya, right? So like the data doesn't say that either. But you're right. That would be a good reason to give up on race. But people seem to not do that. They seem to say, okay, fine, there's East and West, two different races. Even though I'm going to call you black if you're from either one. But I'm going to say, like, for this talk of sprinting and running, those are two races. And they just easily do that, which is, I think, they kind of missed the point there.
But based off of what you're saying, and because I'm just articulating my thoughts to make sure that you can correct me if I've misinterpreted or misheard of or misconceived of anything of what you said. But part of what I was thinking too is, even if people then say, okay, well, West African and East African are two different races, that still falls apart to me because of the thing called diaspora, right? Because if for something to be racial in the ways that a lot of people try to make things racial by racializing certain information and outcomes and disparities and things like that, to my mind, for something to be racial, to actually fit into whatever boxes we create for anything, it would have to be measurably true, I guess. I don't know how else to put it. Measurably true across the board. And like you were saying, I think one of the strongest points of what you were talking about was the disparity between the US and virtually every other place, but also a lot of the places in the Caribbean, and then the disparity between Jamaica and like virtually everywhere else.
Exactly.
Because even that, like we could say, okay, well, Jamaicans are a race too, but you and I both know in the context of America, people would still say, but it's still racial because Jamaicans are black because, they're descended from Africa.
I know from the Caribbeans that run that believe Jamaicans are a separate race, that those are the rowdy slaves. And like, there's a special, like the Jamaicans are different.
Yeah. And
behave so badly.
And,
this isn't an American, like black, white racialization, but people do this. And they're serious, right? It sounds crazy, like in the context of the U.S., because the U.S. is black and white. But no, people think, they're Jamaican. Like,
yeah. But the thing that resonates with me in that like area of discourse about all of this is the fact that I'm consistently talking with people about, asking the question of does capital R racism travel? Because right now there is this narrative that the thing that people call white supremacy is everywhere, anti-blackness is everywhere. It's global, it's omnipresent, and thereby whoever you are, wherever you are, if you go to a place where there are mostly racialized white people, then you will experience the thing. And if you go to a place where there are predominantly racialized black people, white supremacy is still there because the Europeans were there, and all this other stuff that comes along with that way of thinking. But one thing that I've been exploring and uncovering with my students, for example, is the fact that we could go to any country at any time period and we could find racialization happening. We could find different races, in other words. And racialization is always bad because, like you were saying really eloquently, there's virtually nothing positive about being racialized if you understand what racialization is and how it operates in these different places. In America, we have the black-white dichotomy, but in other places, it's what people in America would conceive to be the sort of white versus white or the black versus black. But really, it's like different ethnic tribes, warring and things like that within the same country. And that we could say then that racism exists everywhere because racialization happens everywhere. Well, one thing I'm talking about in my second book is I think the necessary distinction between racialization, like for example, for Americans to think of Jamaicans as a different race, I think would be obviously equally pernicious. But but there's a difference between racialization and ethnicization. But the difference comes down to how the biases and oppression and prejudice operate in different contexts. And so it looks differently everywhere. And it's always fascinating to me to hear about this kind of pushback that you might receive, and obviously that I receive just as much too, especially as it pertains to the evidence that people would uphold and say, this is proof positive that race is biological, Tade.
Yeah.
But then when you try to walk down the path, they make all kinds of justifications and concessions, and
Constant.
it's the same for you. The evidence that people use as the biological fact of race is what color blindness, what those folks are to the theory of racelessness. Yeah. It's like some people, they don't want to know and they don't want to disbelieve. They want to feel comfortable in their worldview because it serves them in whatever capacity. But the strength of your argument and what I'm really happy to have a better understanding of, I think, boils down to a couple of things, which is namely, for something to be racial, it strikes me that we should not be able to like pinpoint it to a certain place. If whether we pinpointed to Jamaica, or whether we pinpointed to Kenya, or whether we pinpointed just to West Africa, more broadly speaking, or East Africa, as some people want to say distance runners derive from, but you say is not factually true.
Wherever, not factually true. It's not factually true that sprinters don't derive from Kenya.
Yeah, right.
Kenya's history in marathoning and long distance is pretty incredible. They're also good at sprinting.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not the only. So North Africa has a history of being like, it's weird that North Africa has a history of the middle distance, like not the really long, not the really short, for some reason, right? And then East Africa has this big history of very, very long running, like the marathon. But it's also the marathon. It sucks. Who wants to run the marathon, right? So it's like, if there's a culture that adopts it, right? Then I said there's one famous Jamaican marathon, right? And he's a Jamaican, and he's fine. He was like a world-class marathoner. But everyone was like, "What are you doing, man? We don't do that." And it's like that nobody wants to run 26 miles with you, right? So it's like, it's a hard thing to do on your own. Who wants to be a marathoner, right? So Kenya already has a tradition of being a marathoner, right? So they already do that. So they and that's one of those things where it's not fun. So like, it's gonna be hard to get that up and going if you're in a country where people don't do that. Like, how do you convince them to be first? So there's fast runners all over Africa, in every country, different distances. But there's fast runners that like all over the world, like there really are. And it's a strange thing to but yeah, you can see that race has its biggest effect in how people think of themselves. That is the biggest thing it does, because most people aren't going to be the best, right? Like, no matter what your race is, you're not going to be the best.
Period.
And it's just, yeah, right. That's just the numbers say that genetically you probably are fated not to be the best. That's just how it is, right? So it's just, anything to make that brutal fact even worse is only going to take that away from you. But you can see, like, when you go to Jamaica, like that they run, like you go there and like the amount of running that they do is incredible. And also the amount of cultural capital that they put towards sprinting is incredible, right? So like, for them, they don't have the Super Bowl, but they have like the high school track championships. And it's interesting, because there's actually a book about it. That guy who commissioned a study to do biopsies of Jamaican athletes, and the study failed. The good thing about that, and like the reason why, that's a case of sort of good, bad science, right? He went, he did it, it failed. And then he happened to be there, coincidentally, on Champs Weekend. And Champs Weekend is their high school championship. And he saw like how insane the island gets during that weekend, because like that's their Super Bowl, right? Like, everybody's watching these kids run. He's like, oh, okay, well, I was wrong about my theory. I think this is why. So I think, he was able to see that cultural, like, and I think a lot of this stuff, the reason why people, like, they racialize people is they don't know, like, when you know the sport, like, you can go to Southern California to like USC, and you can go to that campus at 7 o'clock. I don't know about now since COVID, but before COVID, you could go at 7 o'clock and you'll see probably 300, mostly Black kids. The LA Running Cougars, it's been a track club that's been going for like 50 years. They produce tons of athletes and they run. They sprint constantly. And yeah, we don't have it to the scale that the Jamaicans have it. But there are some sort of cultural centers in the U.S. where you have an African American track history, like the Santa Monica Track Club. Like there's a few places where they still maintain that sort of track culture, and so yeah, you can see that's where all the athletes come from, where they all come from, right? There's not a lot of Black American sprinters from Chicago. There's a lot from Texas, right? Like just the states that they come from, but nobody no one has a problem with those disparities. So I'm saying so if it turns out that of all the Black American sprinters, none of them come from Chicago and they all come from Texas, no one's genetics, but the disparity is just as great, right? So we can see that things that you don't think are genes produce these massive disparities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that matters.
So that's the sort of second takeaway that I'm getting from you, which is that environment, which I view culture as, indicative of one's environment, matters and has a significant enough of an influence on outcomes. And it's and that none of that, again, it's none of that has to do with race, even though it can sometimes appear that it does have to do with race. And I think at the outset you were talking about the NBA and you were talking about the significance of height in a sport like that and things like that, which does boil down to genetics, but also you could be, the tallest person in the world to be hyperbolic and be the worst basketball player. You ostensibly, you have to have some kind of serious training.
Yeah, some interest.
Right.
I think culture is really important, but I think culture, it's true. It's definitely related to culture, but I think it's better to just say, that which you do, this when
but
Tade, do something a lot, then they usually do it well.
Before I forget though, because what I'm counting as part of culture is what you said a few times now, which is that how you think about your ability is going to often inform your ability or how you actually approach something. And I feel like that's really critical in an aspect of the conversation about environment or culture that people tend to miss or overlook, because in some ways there's something positive to be said about how energized Jamaica is around the track events or celebrations or whatever it is, right? Because they really value that, and they value the athletes, and they value the positive attention and all, and the tourism and all the things that probably come along with some of that. And in the United States, there are different communities that are going to value different things. And I think especially if you're talking about underserved communities and the school systems and stuff, they're going to push athletics a lot of times because they view that as a sort of ticket out of poverty, out of the circumstances, out of the environment. And at the same time, if the messaging is such that, well, you cannot achieve this, or you cannot do well at this or be great at this because of how you're racialized, then that has detrimental effects too. And we see
momentum is also super important, right? So momentum is real, right? So it's if a guy from America goes to a group of people in Cameroon called the Dinka, and there's a lot of really tall people there, right? So I think Joel Embiid is NBA player, comes from this, tribal ethnicity, what do you want to call it, right? You can see that there's a few Maasai, who are the tallest people in the world, from Kenya. You can see that, they have this sort of, a lot of them are really tall. So they start to play basketball because this one guy starts to play basketball. So they have like this small advantage in height. Maybe it's somewhat significant, but it shouldn't be that deterministic. But because they have this advantage, they have these guys that are good. So then they start playing more. So, right, it's like where there are like the best sort of genetic racial argument would be sort of, okay, maybe it impacts your sort of starting capacity, right? Like you have this small, and that's what you see happens all the time. Even when you train people, like you realize that, like I have a friend, he's one of like the top trainers in track. He's like, yeah, a lot of times you have white athletes and they'll like walk in a different way. And it's like, they'll be trained in a different way from when they're like really young, and that'll put them on like a different trajectory, right? So it is true that like there are these like differences that get multiplied, but the differences that you're seeing are almost always what the person's been doing for the last 20 years, not how they were born. But yeah, but how you were born can really impact you, and then in the race that you perceive yourself to be can really impact you. But and I think for sports is where, like, I put this on Twitter and I got a lot of hate for it, right? So I said, the chief racializer is yourself, which I think is true. And I think if it wasn't true, I think racelessness wouldn't be so appealing, right? Because racelessness, if it was true that the chief like racializer is everyone else, then which I think is what they believe, right? Is that you wouldn't be able to like liberate yourself, or there's no point, because what you think about yourself doesn't matter. But I think that's clearly false. And I think, all the pushback I got was people like, yeah, well, it doesn't matter what I think about myself, because when I get around the cops, they're going to think of me this way, or like when I have to go to work, my boss is white, or he's going to think of me like this, right? But first of all, like, you don't know what other people think about you, right? And what you think about yourself impacts what other people think of you. So I think it's just sort of a childish argument to be able to even presume what everyone else is going to think about you, right? But that's this sort of claim. And we can see for sports, it's just not true. For sports, like what you think about yourself has a huge impact, right? So like, okay, fine. If you want to argue that like racelessness won't free you from police brutality because the cop will still racialize you one way, so it doesn't make sense to try to de-identify yourself with race. Okay, fine. But de-identifying yourself with race will like liberate you with respect to sport. And that I think is super clear, because you can see how people conceive of themselves as a huge impact on their ability in sport, right? And I, for me, I guess because that's part of like my background, sports. So it's like you see like how you perceive yourself definitely matters, right? And which I think is this new, I don't know what you call it, it's a socially constructed race that people talk about. Like the other day, I realized it's like, wow, like this is worse than the other racism. Right? This is worse because the other racism is like telling you that, oh, you have this deficiency, like you're Black, but maybe you're the smart one, like I'm going to stereotype you like this, and then you can prove me wrong, and then you'll be like the exception, and then you can be like treated the same. But this new one there's no way out of it, right? This new one says like, this is how everyone sees you, so you may as well accept it. Like the world sees you like this, and you like how you perceive of yourself has no bearing on like how you navigate the world. And like it doesn't matter what you do, like you are forever this because they see you like that. It's crazy, because that's the exact probably worst thing you can tell to somebody in sports, right? Is to put something on them that's outside of themselves. And that's what this sort of like this concept says. Right.
Yeah. So one connection that I want to make before we conclude between what you're saying and other spheres.
We have to watch those videos real fast. They're kind of a joke, but I sent you 2 videos.
We'll close with that,
okay,
then.
Okay,
if they're kind of a joke, then we'll close with that.
Well, they're good, but they're in honor of Kobe Bryant, and I think it'd be a good thing to close with.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So you said, what do you think about yourself as a huge impact on yourself?
Yeah.
And that makes me think of the achievement gap, what other people would call the opportunity gap. And I can't remember if I've spoken at any length with you about any of this, but it has been proven, there's a lot of literature that exists that shows that racist ideas about racialized Black students does influence and inform and has in many ways created and widened the achievement gap. And you have people like Roland Fryer, who obviously doing amazing work and a bunch of research, whose data has shown that and upheld that idea, right? That one of the causations for the achievement gap is the sincere belief of the instructors or the administrators at the schools that those kids can't learn. Those kids usually being poor kids, and then also you often being racialized Black kids. And in his presentation that he gave, which I can't remember if you came in afterwards or if you were able to see it, but in his presentation,
I caught the second half for sure.
Okay. So the first half, he was talking purely about education, and he said, and he went over his tables and stuff where he was talking about how they came up with these 5 tenets, these 5 rules for what had to happen at every school that he came in and like took over and basically tried to help. And one of their first steps was to interview and talk with all of the existing teachers and staff. And if they said that the students couldn't learn, there's nothing you can do to help them learn, they can't learn, those people lost their jobs. And if people express like, the students can learn, I just need professional development, I need the right toolkit or whatever, then those people kept their jobs.
Yeah.
And he said that within 2 to 3 years so far at the schools that he's been in, with following the 5 rules and rooting out the people who disbelieved in the ability of the students, they closed the achievement gap, which sounds almost magical to a lot of people, because a lot of people are so pressed to say, oh, the IQ disparities that are racial, these people can't learn, right? All of the stuff that goes along with that, but completely ignoring it or obscuring the fact that how you think about yourself is often going to be informed by how people think of you in a lot of ways. And if you are a child and your mind is malleable and stuff like that, and you pick up on this unspoken message that you can't learn or you can only do but so much, you begin to internalize it. And that's what we see with children. So that by certain grades, those children who, if put in a different circumstance with people who had high expectations, maintained the high expectations, et cetera, would thrive. In these other environments that they basically inherit, they don't thrive, right? It's like the exact opposite effect. They fall behind in reading level and math levels and all of the above, and are fortunate enough to graduate from high school and et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, let's not overlook the fact in our rush to try to make this about IQ or quote unquote race, or about an inferior culture, which people racialize as well. Let's recognize that environmental factors, which are cultural, but not in the ways that people assume, kind of like what you're saying, are also at afoot here. And that all of the things have to really come together in order for the outcomes to be
they know though different. I mean, they're lying, like they know, because I
don't think a lot of people know.
The thing is, like, okay, in their view, the world is racist, like the others are racist, never them, of course, but like other people like are racist, so like they're gonna see you and they're gonna treat you differently because they racialize you. There's nothing you can do about that, so you may as well embrace your like racial identity because it's socially real, right? And this
those people know. Those people know it's bullshit, because plenty of everyone else denies that reality.
But then they'll say things like, but if that's true and that there's nothing you can do, like your perception of yourself doesn't matter, then why do they get mad when a teacher says something that's like racist toward you? Like, it should only matter that if the teacher is racist, how that affects their action. Because if the teacher says something like, I think that you're inferior, that doesn't actually hurt you. If that doesn't give you a worse grade, what does that do? That affects your sense of self. That affects how you feel. And they object to that, which is correct. You should object to that, because at the end of the day, like, how the individual feels about themselves is incredibly important. Right. So like,
I see what you're saying.
It's not important. Like it's, we all know that's important. Like, they know it's important. Like, they know that how you feel about yourself is like, you are the chief person in charge of your identity. You are, and they can pretend it's not true. But if it wasn't true, you live in a completely like their concept of what's harmful and not harmful would have to be completely switched, right? Because it would be, if that person's racist thoughts impact their actions or their behavior, they grade you unfairly, or they don't put you for promotion, that's bad. It doesn't matter what they say about how they perceive you, because what can that hurt you? We know what that can hurt you. That can hurt you because that can change how you perceive yourself.
Right.
But they said that doesn't matter. They said that, like, you can't escape it. Right? There's no liberation because it doesn't matter how you perceive yourself, but clearly it does, right? So
I see what you're.
It's a circular argument.
I see what you're saying. That there's a paradox and a sort of conceptual gap between, because this line of argument comes up often enough in my work too, right? Where people will say, but the individual doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter if the individual, just like what you're saying, right? It doesn't matter what the individual thinks of themselves, if they count themselves as Black, or if they count themselves as white, or whatever, or it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because the individual doesn't matter. It's the system. But it's like, so we're just going to pretend. And this sort of disingenuous aspect of all this. I feel like we're definitely vibing and on the same page with it, because in my mind, I'm like, so we're just going to pretend like how people are affected individually isn't also part of the outcry, right? Because regardless of, I cannot control what Tade thinks of me. Certainly, I can only control and have influence over how I process or receive what Tade thinks of me, or what he says to me, or how he treats me, or whatever. Putting you on the spot. But it's like, if you take the individual aspect out of it, if you only focus on the systems, then you can't cry out about how Tade is like treating you, because you can't
materially, only materially, right? But because, not what I say about you or how I conceive of you. Like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how I feel about you, or even if I tell you how I feel, or like how I perceive you or how I identify you. All it matters is how I treat you. Right. So if I'm passing you up for promotion, or I'm, beating you, if I'm a policeman, or I'm giving you a poor grade because I'm a racist, all those things matter, but not what I actually say. Like, not my opinions on your value. Those don't matter. Right. Because your opinions on your value don't matter. Like in their conception. Right. Because like, there's no benefit for you to think of yourself in a different way. Right. But it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense because we all realize how harmful it is. Right. To tell somebody that they're like less valuable. It's harmful because they might believe it. Right. And if they believe it, they will be harmed. Right. And because they are in charge of that. Right. But it's just this, and that's why I think the sports analogy is good, because you see it not even about race. Like, a great story real quick is that 4-minute mile got broken. No one could do it. No man could do it. This guy did it in like 1954. Within like 8 years or 10 years, high school kids were like doing it. You see this over and over and over again. People believe stuff's impossible, believe they can't do it. They realize they can do it. And like, when you train in track, you get to these points where like, you just don't believe something. And then sometimes you'll see someone do it, you have a great day. And then like, you just get to like a new level. And it's just crazy, right? Because you're like, oh, now I'm here. Like, I believe I can do this. And it's really hard to jump up. But a lot of it is really like, it's hard to convince yourself that that's possible. Right. Like, you do hold yourself back. Right. And like, you have to get past all these different barriers that you set. And it's just like, anyone who like, that's I don't know about all sports, but a lot of people who play sport, they understand that. Like, they understand that like how you conceive of yourself is massively important. Mm-hmm. What you can do is massively important. And it really is. Like, so I just think that sport is a great analogy for so many things. And I used to be like sort of not want to bring it up, because I think people kind of say, oh, if you like sports, that makes you dumb because you're like a jock or something. But now I'm just like, sports is really cool, because I saw this dumb thing with Jordan Peterson, and he was talking about, I like equal opportunity, but I don't like equal outcomes. And it's like, okay, yeah, that sounds great, right? But come on, bro, like outcomes are opportunities. That's the complexity. And it's like sport is interesting, right? Because like, yeah, when, I think the Golden State Warriors won the championship. So we gave them a championship. We did not give the other team a championship. They didn't get, like, the Boston Celtics didn't get a championship because that would, but the Golden State Warriors get the last pick next year in the draft. The team that was the worst got the best pick. So like, according to like Jordan, so that is like, we're rewarding the worst team with a higher pick, right? Like with an advantage. So like sport has all these different things where like, yeah, like we don't give a trophy, but we actually do give something to the person that did the worst, because we want to like foster a competitive environment. So the outcome, sure, if it's a trophy, you should never give it to the person who doesn't win. But if the outcome is like, what if the outcome was, if you do well on your test, you get to go to college, which is clearly not just an outcome, it's an opportunity, right? So like if the outcome for being the best team was to get the first pick in the draft the next year, that would mess up sport, right? So yeah, of course, nobody wants unequal outcomes, or like you should never equalize the outcomes when the outcomes are purely a reward. When that comes a trophy that has no intrinsic value except for the record the fact that you won, of course you shouldn't give that to like the person who lost. But when the outcome's another opportunity, you need to think about that, right? Think about like what system's the best. So this simplistic idea, and so sports is, as much as it might not be an intellectual exercise, it actually it's good to think about because it's a small model for like, it's a small like model where you want to like foster like competition, like excellence, right? It's very capitalist in some ways, but you see that, there's benefits to like redistributing each year, like taking from like the best team and like giving to the worst team. That actually benefits the league as a whole. So I think sports is, so now I'm not as like sort of afraid to like bring up the fact that there's a lot we can learn from sport, right? And I think it's actually good because it's something that we kind of all know something about too. It's in most cultures, to some extent, it's like to play sports or to train and to be interested like in this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I'm thinking of all of the ways in which my life would be drastically different if I didn't always believe in myself,
Yeah.
And then I'm also thinking about the sort of, I think people might call it a straw man, but I've seen people say in response to what we're articulating here, right, that how one thinks of themselves actually matters for a lot of reasons and can actually inspire and inform certain outcomes. I've seen people in pushback to that say, but like, name one time and place where somebody was teaching little so-called Black kids that they can't do X, Y, and Z or something like that. And then it seems like you're kind of ghost hunting or something, because you're like, oh, well, there's a specific time and place where those exact words came from a teacher or something. But I think what makes it particularly like sneaky and pernicious and probably there's some overlap with the sports analogy too, is the fact that it's not any of the students that I've worked with in 9th through 12th grade and primarily in Arkansas, Mississippi, and Texas, they wouldn't say or have stories necessarily of a teacher or a principal who said, so-and-so, you can't do X, Y, and Z because you're Black, right? Like it doesn't work that way all the time. Sometimes there might be some horror stories where somebody actually said that, right? And I've seen women share this too, like people telling them what they can and can't do because they're a woman. And so that can happen where people can be really explicit with their bias. But something that's sneaky about how racialization works is that it's not necessarily that outright or explicit, except nowadays, because of the ways that we're racializing our curriculum and doing all these things, it probably is becoming more explicit.
I would say that it's been told to me like multiple times.
What? Say it.
I can't do something because I'm Black. Like it might not be explicit, but it's, if someone says, oh, don't forget to put that you're black on a application because they'll probably get in. That makes me think,
Oh yeah.
I'm worse. Like it makes, or they say, oh, you run fast. It must be because you're part black. That makes it, okay, so black makes you, so then it must not be why I'm doing well in school. Right. So it's like this sort of thing. It's like, well, that's where you get that ability from. So not where you get this other ability from. Right. So I mean, all the time, I think that you're hearing, or when you say like, oh, I wonder why these like, Chinese kids are doing so good in math, and someone's like, that's racism. Well, it's clearly not that. So they must be like much better than us. Right. So it's like, instead of saying like they do it more, right, it's like that's not that harsh of a truth. I mean, for me, I like when I went to like grad schools, when I finally learned, I was with a bunch of kids from China, and like they were so much better than us. And I made really good friends with one kid. And he was just explaining like he's like, you don't realize that like how you guys do sports, like we do like repetitions, the same thing. Like that's how we do math. Like you guys just like learn the math. We like do it. Like you can already do the math, and it's like if I just ask you questions over, not just when you're like a really little kid, you probably you like memorize your times table, but like even like as you're growing up, it's like you're like practicing your math, right? And so I was like, oh, so you guys are really good because you do this all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like crazy that instead of telling a kid like, yeah, the Chinese kids are going to do better than you because they're doing it way more than you. Even if you said the Chinese kids are going to do better than you because they're genetically advantage and you need to work harder to beat them, I think that'd be more positive than just like making up a nebulous things. That's, I think, especially for kids, when you hear like BS, you're just like, okay, you're lying. And like it's the true answer is probably much worse. I think it makes you become really like fatalistic, right? If someone tells you like, oh, why aren't we doing well in school? Well, it's because of systemic racism. Instead of saying like, if you wanted to do well in school, you can like do way more studying. I actually think that would help you as a kid more. And even if I'd rather have someone say something that's explicitly racist than this is like implicit excuses. I think as when you're a kid, you hear when someone makes excuses for you, you think that you're inferior.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I guess one thing that I'm thinking through is like, because I think it's both. Like, I think there are instances of explicit hierarchy that gets carried through. I mean, my entire first book is me translating that which is perceived to be race or racial into racism itself. And so I that strikes me as all true, but I think it's also the case that sometimes the bias is a sort of subconscious, like not intentional. In other words, it comes through so I'm a teacher. Well, you're a teacher. We're both professors here. So, if I go into my undergraduate classroom and I'm presuming that my students can't learn, I'm not going to teach them the same way than if 100%. I go into another classroom where I feel like, wow, these are rock stars, they're geniuses. So that's how I'm talking about that's important to recognize that too, because it's not the explicit stuff happens and continues to happen, unfortunately, probably at an increased frequency, if we're being honest, given the landscape, or I should say, and the sort of subconscious stuff too comes out where I might not be expressing outright.
There's a paper about mice. It's gonna blow your mind. You're gonna love it.
Please send it.
They take these researchers, they trick them, and they tell them that these mice are like really smart and these mice are really stupid.
Sounds like the Jane Elliott.
They test the mice on these like intelligence tests, like like being able. It's not just intelligence, but like to like balance on like the like rotor rod, which is like something that we do on mice, like make it through a maze. All these different tests for mice, and the mice that are smart do way better than the dumb mice. They have videos on them, and they the only difference is the way that the humans handle the mice. These are mice. So like think about how many ways that we interact. Like mice, mostly are like driven by scent. I imagine we don't smell good to them. They can barely see. But like we touch each other, we look at each other, like we are both the same species. And so just thinking that these mice are incapable, you can make them incapable. Wow. Just like the mice, you don't handle them as well. Maybe you you drop them instead of like place them like in the cage. Like these minor things can have a big impact on like the ability of the animal to perform. And nothing about us, right? Like we're the same species, and we have way more language, like way more that we can do. So it's so like you're totally right. I mean, the implicit expectation that you put on somebody, even if it's just handling a mouse, massively impacts their performance. And that, but again, why is that? It's not because the mouse thinks, it's because the mouse, you know, I mean, this is anthropomorphizing, but the mouse thinks it's worse, right? Like the mouse doesn't have as much belief, right? Like,
right.
Right. Like, and what's interesting is they even tested the humans are not cheating, which is what we all thought, right? If you think that, okay, yeah, of course you're gonna like fudge the numbers, you're gonna help out the smart ones, but no, like there was a little bit of that, but even when you take that away, it still happens, right? So I mean, it's mind blowing, like how much of an impact you have on people, but the impact that you have on them is how they becomes their ability, because it's
exactly.
Right. It's not that you have an impact because you grade the Black students more mean because you think they're less capable. If anything, you'd probably like grade them in
easier,
a nicer way because you think they're less capable, right? So like the impact is all through them. It's all through their brain, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that's why the sort of either or of the individual or the system, right? Or, you know, something, an officer is going to look at me in that way. So there's no value in me not looking at myself in that way. That's why I think it's so foolish. I think earlier was the nicer word that it's so foolish because it's like so obvious to me and to you how both of the things matter, and like both of the things influence and inform and inspire the other. And we are fooling ourselves if we don't recognize the value in addressing both, right? And both at the same time. It's not, oh, we got to fix what's external first, and then we can help individuals, you know, work on their individual stuff. No, we have to be doing these things at the same time. Okay, so you said you want to watch, what is with the Jay-Z picture too? Because I'm like, what did, okay.
I just thought that was funny.
All right. Which, does it matter which video I played first?
With, the one with Manu, but it's the one with the guy with like a bow tie maybe in the front or something. I'm not sure.
Let's see.
Just go for it. If it's the wrong one, it's okay.
Whoops. Pause.
It has like Spanish subtitles in the bottom.
We're about to we're back to the video. The trouble is I couldn't download the video to my computer, so I'm having to go into Twitter to do it. And then I'm trying not to let all of my messages in Twitter show. But
I see.
Truth be told, the messages are innocuous. So I'll just
the
go
top
for
one
it.
first. Yeah. This is the one.
All right.
Yeah.
I forgot to do the audio sharing thing. Hold on one second. Share sound. Okay, take two.
Hey Bruce, who's this white boy? And I'm like, he's no white boy.
So when I first matched up with him, and he was real shifty with the ball, he just shifted one way, went the other way, and I was like, who the hell is this kid? If anything.
Yeah, so we can put that down.
Okay.
So that is, I thought that was interesting because that's
hey Bruce, who's this?
This other one, yeah, you can play the other one now. This one's kind of funny, but.
What do you remember about that play?
All I remember was Cole telling me that I've been going to the hole like a light-skinned dude, so I got to start going like a dark-skinned. So when I seen the lane open up, that's all I remember.
You went to the hole like a dark-skinned dude?
Yeah.
So those are two. So I think the first one's really interesting because if you know the stories behind the athletes there, it's obviously Kobe Bryant, right? So they're talking Kobe Bryant. So, I mean, we all love him. And so he's talking about Manu Ginobili, he's an Argentinian basketball player. He was known for having like a really unorthodox game, the way he played. He played kind of like a playground style. And what's interesting is when this idea that he goes, who's the white boy? And then the response is, that's no white boy. But what's interesting is in sports, racialization kind of changes. And that's something that you'll hear a lot in sports, is that people will really differentiate between it's very different between like in academia, how like you're racialized as white. And in sports, like if you're an Eastern European basketball player, like that guy's not a white boy. He's Eastern European. He like lived through wars. He's not soft, right? So there's all these ideas about race. And there's this idea that like American white basketball players play a certain way. And if you're not American, and you might look like one of them, but like as far as sports goes, you're not white, right? As far as like his game isn't white, right? And it's interesting that like he was like re-racialized, right, as non-white because of the way he plays basketball, right? And so it's the same thing. If you talk to like people like who play, they'll say, yeah, like an Eastern European is different because these, if you're like from like Yugoslavia, you went through like a bunch of wars. You're not some kid from like the country club, like in the US who's a great shooter but afraid to like play defense. And even within race, right, the second clip is funny because they even do that within race, right? Like that you can play like a dark skin or a light skin, and it just shows that like race in sports in some ways it becomes sports is very racialized, but within the sport, when you know the sport, it's a lot of athletes that I count as really close friends, they have a lot of insane ideas about race and sports, but it's very data driven, right? So they'll say, like, okay, this is how white people do it. And then they'll be like, okay, these Eastern Europeans, they're not white because they don't do it like that. Yeah, like obviously what would make sense would be to sort of deracialize when you see the contradictions, but sports people are very willing to sort of just change the rules, right? So there's like in basketball, there's like you can play like a light skinned or a dark skin, and that becomes like, and like he's not the first person to like say that. And to me, so it's interesting to see how race works within, like between, right? It's just these stereotypes get made, and then like, but you can free yourself in sport, and that's what I think is interesting. In sports, you can get out of it, right? Like, you'll get re-racialized, which is kind of annoying, right? But you'll be a light skin who plays like a dark skin, right? You'll be no longer a white boy, even if you have super white skin, right? But I think I think in some ways sports is sort of, a lot of athletes aren't as educated in science, but in some ways I think sports is actually ahead of mainstream society in that conversation, because it's a weird way to do it, to just swap race or color, but it's more progressive, because I feel like, at least in my professional life and like my, I guess, higher society, US, I think there's less room to do that for people. Like, you're not allowed to do that, right? You're not, in fact, like you're stuck like where you are, which I think is unfortunate.
Tade, I'm really curious. This isn't something that we've spoken about, but I'm really curious. So you said earlier that you've been told, I know we said we're going to end with the videos, but of course I have a question, that you've been told that you can't do certain things because you're Black. How would people? No,
I would say it's more that you can do certain things because you are.
Oh, that you can do certain things, right?
Like and jump high.
Your sports abilities and things like that.
Yeah, and so, but how else do I take that as like, I've never been told that about my academic ability ever.
Right.
And I've never been told, oh, your dad's that must be why you're so good at math. Never heard that. So I'm just saying that implicitly, it's something that for me was like, okay, if I get this ability here, I must get my ability to do math from like my mom, even though my mom can't do math at all. I hope she's not watching this, but she's terrible. My dad's was a lot better at math. But you're right. Like, it's just like one of those things where I would hear different stereotypes for different things.
Right.
And so I think that's that when someone says that, especially like if you look like me and no one can really tell, and then you do something like, you dunk a basketball and people ask, oh, where are you from? Like, oh, that's why. It also takes away the athletic accomplishment as well, right? It's just it's not a good thing to do, to just attribute an individual's ability to a race and like genetic ability,
Yeah.
Right. Because I wouldn't say I've really heard people say that I can't do something because
Right.
like on account of race. I mean, I can't remember if that's happened.
You answered one of my questions, I think, by accident, because then my question was going to be, in any given context, how would people know to racialize you as Black?
What do you mean?
Because like you were just saying, people would look at you and not necessarily presume, or maybe if they were trying to,
you're doing something Black, you're sprinting.
but then they ask
That's
you.
the first thing that people are going, well, hopefully, I mean, if you win, you'll definitely be asked. I mean,
So
not
then
if you're like blonde, like if you it depends how you look, I think.
Right.
It depends like where you are phenotypically. But I think I'm phenotypically in a place where like, if I perform well in sprinting, I'm going to be asked like, what are you? It's literally like that. Not like where you're from or your parents are from, like, what are you? Right. Yeah. And so I think it's, if you're doing something that has any racial valence at all, you're gonna, in sports is almost always does. I mean, I'm not like a baseball player. I'm sure, I guess if I played baseball, maybe I'd be like Hispanic or something. I don't know. But I mean, it's pretty common.
That was my question because, in what is it, chapter 3 of my first book, I talk extensively about how uncomfortable people have been historically about people who are perceived to be as racially ambiguous, and the sort of passing literature, the passing genre of American literature that exists. It's just chock full of these instances of people having to readily racialize themselves and proclaim their quote unquote racial heritage, or hide their racial heritage by virtue of not announcing in any given circumstance what their race is, and or going into spaces that are supposed to be for quote unquote whites only, which, given the historical context, and then not even making the choice to go in those places as opposed to the places that were for colored people only, etc. And in some instances, the literature fictionalizes the kind of estrangement one can have from their own biological family members because of this rejection of quote unquote race and all that other stuff. And it's a literature that I'm obviously very familiar with and also fascinated by, because of the fact that you would think that those instances and the fact that people have like fit into the fictional accounts of what it is to be racially ambiguous by how a person looks, and having to like announce one's race and stuff, you would think that would throw the whole thing under question, right? That would be like evidence for disrupting the sort of black and white way of thinking and stuff. And I mean, it's just, so I asked because I was fascinated. How did people determine that you were Black?
Indian people, these Indian guys who want to know their like lineage really bad. And Wilfred was like, I mean, you can see the podcast, but he was like, it's probably not important. I mean, we all kind of agreed, but he was like, okay, that's fine that all of us on this podcast think that like your identity isn't so important, but like for some people it really is. And it's like, well, I just can't see how that's helpful, but I have to be honest, like you can't see it, but that's also because of like who I am, right? Like, because I never got to have one identity. And so like, maybe I would, I don't know. But it was never really an option for me to like be authentically something. And so maybe there's a little personal bias to that like I want to get everyone else on my side, right? So like there could be some of that, and that's what I was thinking, right? Like there could be some. It's like I never got to have that, so like I don't want you guys to either, almost, right? Like then I'll feel real left out. But I mean, in seriousness, it's like there's a weird thing where we should like people who are sort of naturally unraced, right? So like I think that anybody can unrace themselves, but some people are phenotypically a little bit more outside of the system. But I mean, I don't know if you've heard this, but I've heard this from a lot of people that like light-skinned people go hard on like social justice. And I think a lot of that is because like it's actually almost harder to disrupt, because like if you are not Black, not white, or you're some in-between thing, and you don't look clearly like racial category, and then you try to disrupt it, like people are really going to get mad at you, right? Because people are from like both sides can call you out as like inauthentic, because you're authentically like nothing, right? So like it's hard if you're the person who doesn't get fully racialized somewhere to be the one to like lead that group out of it, because they're like, yeah, that's what you want to do because you're white, right? So I think there's some truth to that like there you can kind of go one way or the other. And so a lot of people that are sort of not fully racial, they push harder, right? So like you go hard for social justice because you're like, you want to emphasize like this racial part of yourself, because you don't have it just from jump, right? You don't like, people don't just like give it to you, so you adopt something to get it. So yeah, I think we should be disruptive, but race is super pernicious, and like it's like it's like a virus, and like one of the ways it's so successful is it impacts the people that should disrupt it, and it makes it even harder for them to do that, right? Because it puts them as, oh, you guys can't be the ones to like talk about this, right? Like, so I think that yeah, but I mean, from like a phenotypic perspective or like a logical like perspective, like people that aren't clearly racialized should be the disruptors. Like they should be the ones like calling this fake. But a lot of people I know who are like, like very fair are very defensive about the fact that they're Black. Like a lot of people I know who, like if you look at them, you can't really tell what they are. They'll be like very much in your face about like, this is what I am, right? And so it's weird, because you would think that you would get sick of that and stop wanting to adopt a racial identity at all. But I mean, I guess I can sympathize with where that comes from, but it's bad. It's not a good place to be, right? To be in this point where like you need to prove yourself.
Yeah, it's interesting because I hear both both opposing stereotypes of people who would be identified as mixed, and particularly as being racialized as Black and white. I hear the stereotype that it's, somebody said this about me on Twitter. It was some snide comment about beige Twitter, and it was like, it's always mixed people who see through the nonsense of race or whatever. It was like, I see that kind of thing a lot. And then, but I've also heard the kind of stereotype that you're talking about in the sort of opposite direction of this sort of holding on to Blackness. And the literature that I was talking about, the passing genre, part of the problem, part of what has helped to maintain racialist ideology in a lot of respects is the fact that the readers of the literature of that same genre have been taught and continue to teach students of that literature to moralize the decision of the fictional characters, right? If the character rejects their so-called Blackness, we could take the autobiography of an ex-colored man by James Weldon Johnson as a prime example. If the protagonist rejects their so-called Black identity, my students are distraught. They are upset.
Yeah.
They're viewing all kinds of morality. They're kind of in my mind missing the entire point of the novel. And time and time again, we see how the literature has been taught and how it's been canonized and how it's been interpreted in ways that, instead of calling the whole thing into question, as they probably should have helped to do, it's only helped people double down on the perceived importance and significance of so-called racial identity. And to make matters worse, I think it's also that way of thinking has also encouraged people to marginalize and exclude and hide and obscure the philosophies of race, the sort of alternative philosophies of race from people who would be obviously Black in the American context, who have shared and written a lot of the literature that's on passing and have shared skeptical eliminativist views about race. Because again, it's like no matter who it's coming from or how it's coming, people in this country have really held onto and clung to the Black and white, pun intended, ways of viewing themselves and each other, to the detriment of our, nation, I would argue, and to the detriment of individuals. Mhm. Well, Tade, I invite you to have the last word, sir. I know we always run long. We always talk for like 16 hours, but
we don't have any pressing questions, right?
Let me see. Let me just see if you're
I'll give
open
them the
to
last
it.
word. If there's a good question, I'll answer it.
See. Well, Ogie, shout out to you if you're still here. Ogie said, it's not a question, it's a comment. He said, I don't know how else Dr. Mason can make it more clear that theory of racelessness is not colorblindness, neither does it propagate that idea. Yes. Jordan, if you're still there, hopefully you put your questions in here. Ogie also said, good point, Tade. What you are highlighting is the most pernicious part of the effect of trans slavery, the idea that there is a standard of humanity, that people cannot just be people. I'm not sure at which point that was at, but shout out to Ogie for being vocal. Okay, here's a question.
Perfect.
This is from Steve. What is the best way to describe how we get different skin color, and how do the genes actually work? I'm guessing in pertaining to skin color.
Okay.
Any thoughts on that?
I'll tell a funny story about it. So slavery is what caused people to become white. So people, as we know, people came from Africa, and sometime 60,000 to 30,000 people kept leaving and coming. So putting an exact date on it's hard, but say starting like 60,000 years ago, people started to leave Africa. Today we can find fossils of people that died in Europe, that were in Europe 7,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago. So we can now get DNA from people like that old, which is new technology. It's really cool. It's called ancient DNA. So we find fossils. There's a famous fossil, and you don't find many. So a lot of them, they get their own name. So Cheddarman is his name. He's a fossil in England, and he has blue eyes. We know that because we can see his DNA. He has blue eyes, and as far as we can tell from his DNA, he has black skin. And so we've now found multiple fossils in Spain, in England, and I think what's modern Italy. I'm not sure about that one, but in France for sure. And we're finding these people that are Europeans. They have blue eyes. We think the blue-eyed mutation probably happened like 20,000 years ago. So that makes sense that they had already sort of acquired that. And why we get blue eyes, nobody really knows. It's probably just sort of some luck, probably. But as far as we can tell, they're black skin. They're dark skinned people. And what we see happening is after 7,000 years ago, once we invent farming, we see the skin turning white, right? When we look at fossils that are 6,000 years old, they usually have these mutations, and there's a few genes. So I'll just say real quick, there's gene SLC65A. There's a couple of them. There's a few genes that influence the amount of melanin in your skin. And what we see is different versions of these genes that produce less melanin. And so the old theory was people went north. As most people know, the story is a little bit more complicated than people probably have heard, but there's basically two things that matter: folic acid or folate. Dark skin is protective against folate. So when you're in the sun and you're hit by the sun, the melanin can attract the sunlight and the folate isn't destroyed. That's good. Your babies won't have birth defects. That's positive. But also dark skin will also absorb the sunlight and you won't convert as much vitamin D on your skin. It doesn't matter so much because, as you know, there's dark skinned people like in Finland and Sweden today There's white people in South Africa. I mean, you might have to wear sunscreen. You might have to be inside in the heat of the day. If you're really dark skinned, you might take a vitamin D supplement, although you really don't need to as long as you spend some time outdoors. A lot of us don't spend time outdoors, so you do need to. But anyway, so why would there be some big pressure on fair skin if people today can be alive with all types of skin color in Africa and in Europe? Well, what we think what happened was the hunter-gatherers were fine being black. But what happened is we invented farming. And so, you invent farming, and I use the example of potatoes, which is ahistorical. These potatoes came from the New World, but I think that's a good example. Everyone knows the Irish love potatoes. So you imagine that you go from a diet which is built on leaves and berries and like little animals that you catch and like mushrooms and like wild fruit because you're a hunter-gatherer. You switch to a feudal environment, right? So a feudal lifestyle or a what we would call like serfdom, where you farm land. There's a king who eats all the meat, eats all the fruit, and you eat potatoes every day. You eat gruel. So you now have a diet that's extremely low in vitamin D. It basically has none. So on that diet, the pressure, the need to be fair-skinned goes up a lot. So you can go to these charts today, and if you have a bunch of vitamin D in your diet, you'll see, okay, if you have very, very, very dark skin, you need 20 minutes of sun exposure a day. If you're very, very fair skin, you only need 5 minutes. So, okay, hopefully we're all getting 20. If not, you might need a vitamin D supplement. But if you're not eating any vitamin D, eating none, you might need, like almost none. You can't have none, but it's basically none. So if you're having really low levels, well, you might need 30 hours if you're white, which means you're never going to have enough. You're going to be deficient. It's going to make you a little less fertile, but you'll be alive. And if you're dark skinned, you might need 100 hours. Well, there's not 100 hours in the day. So at that point, we switch to this diet. That's when there's all this big pressure on being fair skinned. And I think it's interesting. It's a little controversial, is if you think about like what is farming. Like when you get society, you get farming, you get agriculture, you get serfdom, you get this feudal society. It's sort of akin to slavery, right? Because you don't have any rights. So I like to tell people, well, we can't say white people like created slavery because slavery created white people. So it's not their fault, right? So that's kind of a joke. But in all seriousness, it was diet and sunlight, not just sunlight. So if you hear that, you can correct people and say, it's not just the amount of sun in the environment, it's also the diet, because farming is when we see this explosion of fair skin. And of course, there are other mutations. In South Africa, there's a mutation. And for a long time, we thought it's a separate mutation that can also give you fair skin. So there's complexity. There's probably 5 major genes that we know, and then maybe more. The interesting thing about the South African one is it was long thought to be proof that there was a European or a Near Eastern introgression, which means like people coming in and like mating. So you get new genes. A European introgression into South Africa around like pretty recent, like 2,000 years ago. Paper just came out saying, actually, maybe that came from South Africa and left 2,000 years ago. You don't know, right? Which is kind of interesting because the instinct is when you see these fair-skinned, alleles in South Africa that cause that fair skin, that must have came from Europe, but it also could have came from South Africa and went to Europe, right? So, there was a big evolutionary pressure due to agriculture, and then there's just other sort of random skin lightenings. There is a lot of skin color variance in Africa, right? And why do we have that? I think it's just there's just genetic drift. Like people will just sort of randomly change color, and then the theory is sexual selection. Maybe some fair-skinned person will be really popular, so then people will like that, or a dark-skinned person will be popular. So you'll get diversity of skin color sort of like all around. But the only big environmental pressure was what I said was in Europe. Switching to farming was a massive, massive pressure on fair skin.
Wow, that's fascinating and definitely more interesting than I thought.
Isn't it?
Yeah, I thought it was going to be. Yeah.
It's interesting that 8,000 years ago, people like in England weren't white, right? They certainly weren't white. I think it's silly to call them black or white because like ancient DNA is ancient DNA, and they don't really look like anyone alive today. But 8,000 years ago, it's not that long. Right? It's long, but it's not that long. So it's this white thing, this fair skin thing is new. right? It's new. This is like sort of a new human invention. So, but yeah.
Okay, well, if you have anything else to add, the floor is yours.
That's all. No, that's all. This was great. So I hope I didn't bore you with all the track numbers but I think it's an analytical argument, but it's important for us to realize. And I just want to say, like if you have kids or if you're young enough, or if you want to do like master sports, like don't feel like those stereotypes, right? Like if your kid loves to sprint, let them be a sprinter, right? If your kid loves to run long, because that's the most important thing, right? Like the most important thing for your success is like in sport is like that you like doing it, And so, and the thing is like, it's tough. What's the best mindset? I mean, realistically, probably not going to be the best in the world, but you just don't know unless you try. And like the chance that like the idea of race and sport to me is so preposterous, because if, let's say you believe this, I guess I can close with this. Let's say that you have a son and he's going to run track and he's white or he's black. And you believe that black people are superior at sprinting and all black people in Africa, right? So about a billion people. So he has a 1 in a billion chance of winning. Now let's say he's white. And you believe white people are inferior. They're not as fast. They're like, only half as good as. So now he has a 1 in 2 billion chance of winning. It's still, I mean, what's the difference, right? The difference between 1 in a billion and 1 in 2 billion, they're both very, very small numbers. So, you have to try and do sport to do your best, but to consider your race as an athlete or in sport is only going to hold you back, because the landscape of success in sport and being the best is very unlikely no matter what. So you have to just try to put that out of your head. And so you may as well put the race out of your head too, right? Because it doesn't matter. You can do it, and you probably can't, but you got to think you can. It's the only way. Yeah,
I can't
that's
think
sports, right? That is sports. That's sports in a nutshell.
Sports and life in general.
Life, yeah,
It's like, listen, I get commended all the time for my optimism and energy as it pertains to my theory of racelessness work and development, and it really stems from my inner belief that everything is possible. And that I can do.
Even if you're probably going to fail, it's still possible, right? You have to have some way of dealing with this fact, right?
Exactly.
I mean, people have different ways of dealing with it, but it's like you have to have some way of like, probably going to be a lot of failures, but I'm just going to do it anyway. I'm just going to try. That's it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I love it. Tade, it's always good to chat with you, man. I appreciate you so much. Thanks for spending time with me. And I'm sure we'll come up with another topic to come spend another 3 hours again.
For sure.
Have a good night.